Audio lecture, Constitutionalism in Western Europe and Dutch Art, 1603 to 1720. Key concept. First, we're going to start talking about the English society in the 17th century. Remember, this is right as Elizabeth I dies without an heir, ending the Tudor dynasty. Capitalism played a major role in the high degree of social mobility that they had in England. The gentry, the English gentry, were the wealthy non-noble landowners in the countryside that dominated politics, as well as the House of Commons. The House of Commons was the lower house in Parliament that was the electable House of Parliament. The House of Lords was a hereditary position. The House of Commons was elected. Granted, it is elected, but it is not elected by everyone. Only the wealthy landowners have the right to vote. Many of these gentry had been commercially successful and had moved up from the regular middle class into the upper class, and with that, they gained political access to Parliament. They relied heavily on legal precedent to limit the power of the king on economic and political matters. The House of Commons in the Parliament had the power of the purse, if you will, and kings in England always had to deal with the fact that they could not raise taxes without Parliament's approval. This is one reason why in England the kings never were able to become absolute. They didn't try. Um, the people, the gentry, were willing to pay taxes in England so long as the House of Commons had a say in the national expenditures or national costs of things. Unlike France, there was no stigma to paying taxes in England. Since the tax burden was more equitable in England, the peasantry was not as heavily exploited as we saw they were in France. The issue of taxation brought the House of Commons and the monarchy, however, into direct conflict. When the monarchy wants to raise taxes and the parliament does not want to allow it, we have clashes. Religion was another issue. There were Calvinists in England that comprised perhaps the largest percentage of the population by the early 17th century. These, if you remember from last unit, were the Puritans. They were not the regular Anglican Protestants or Church of England Protestants. They were the ones that wanted to push to make the church in England more like a regular Calvinist Protestant church. Puritans sought to purify the Church of England by removing many of its Catholic elements that still remained, even after Elizabeth had done some, I guess you would say, reforming, spiritual reforming of the church once she was in power. These were ones that wanted more, wanted to push things more. The Protestant work ethic profoundly impacted members of the middle class as well as the gentry in England. So, definition of constitutionalism. Government power is limited by law. There is a delicate balance between the power of the government and the rights and liberties of individuals. This will be key to understanding what happens in England and in the Netherlands. Key concept. Key concept. Problems facing the English monarchs. The Stuarts ruled England for most of the 17th century. Although they exhibited some absolutist tendencies, they were restrained by the growth of Parliament. They wanted to be absolute, but Parliament would, of course, not allow this. They lacked the political astuteness of Elizabeth I of the Tudor dynasty, who had managed to get Parliament on her side so she could act more like a politique. James I, the first Stuart monarch, struggles with Parliament from 1603 to 1625 during his reign. He had been the King of Scotland. Once Elizabeth dies with no heir, her cousin, James, who was James the Sixth of Scotland, becomes James the First of England, starting the new Stuart dynasty. His son, Charles the First, comes after him. He ruled from 1625 to 1629. He doesn't rule very long because he and Parliament really get into a terrible fight. Twice he tried to suspend Parliament and rule without them. He eventually was beheaded during the English Civil War, overtaken by the parliamentary forces. Charles II, after a brief period where we will have no king in England under Cromwell, who we'll talk about later, eventually the Stuart monarchy is restored, and the restoration happens under Charles II. Charles II was the son of Charles I, who had been living in exile, and he will reign from 1660 to 1685. Was restored to the throne, but with the consent of Parliament. Needless to say, he has to agree to a lot of demands that Parliament has by that point. And then, of course, we have James II, the younger brother of Charles II. Charles II will die without a legitimate heir to the throne, and so the power will pass to his younger brother after him. He reigns from 1685 to only 1688. He is the one that will eventually be exiled to France during the Glorious Revolution. We'll discuss all of these as we go through this lecture. Two major issues for the Stuart monarchs in England. 1. Could the king govern without the consent of Parliament? 2. Would the church government follow the existing hierarchical episcopal form, or would it assume a more Presbyterian form, more Calvinist form? The episcopal form was this: the king was at the top, then the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then the bishops of the church determined church doctrine and practices to be used in England. The Presbyterian form would allow for more freedom of conscience and dissent among church members. This was what was primarily used in Scotland. And remember, the new Stuart dynasty comes from Scotland. So many of those Calvinists that had been living in England thought that once the Stuart monarchs were put on the throne, that they might have more of a support from the king to push for this new Presbyterian form. They were wrong, however. Key concept. Key concept. Key concept. Now let's discuss the first of the Stuart kings, James I, who reigned from 1603 to 1625. Background. Elizabeth I left no heir. He was already King James VI of Scotland, and he was next in line to assume the throne. He believed in the divine right of kings, believing that God had willed him to have the power of the throne in Scotland, and the reason why he now was able to have power in England was because God willed it. He claimed, quote, "no bishop, no king," in response to the Calvinist desires to eliminate bishops in the Anglican Church. Those Calvinists who thought they might have more support under a Scottish king were wrong. He was also a firm believer in absolutism, and he hoped that he might be able to force that issue in England once he came to the throne there. Again, he will find resistance from the British Parliament. During James I's reign, he twice dissolved Parliament over issues of taxation and parliamentary demands for free speech, already tangling with them. Elizabeth I had left behind a large debt, and he needed to figure out a way to pay off that debt. He wanted to raise taxes, but Parliament would not allow it. A series of wars, including the 30 Years' War, were costly and required large government revenues. James unwisely flaunted his wealth and damaged the prestige of the monarchy. His own personal wealth um, was something that he wanted to not have to spend on to fix the expenditures of the British crown. So he demanded that new taxes be raised. Parliament refused, and when Parliament refused, he dissolved them, trying to force the taxation on the people without Parliament's consent. This does not gain him a lot of friends in England. Once James I leaves the throne, the problems with Parliament come to a head. His son, Charles I, ultimately inherits the friction. So, background, he is the son of James I. And like James, he claimed that he was a divine right king. He believed in the divine right theory of absolute authority for himself as king, and he sought to rule without parliament if need be. Now, again, remember, the tradition of parliament has been around in England virtually since the 1200s when the Magna Carta was signed by King John II. Now we have these Scottish kings coming in and trying to rule without the consent of Parliament 400 years after the fact. And the people of England were not happy. He also sought to control the Church of England more directly himself. There were tax issues ultimately, like with his father, that pitted Charles I against Parliament ultimately. Charles needed money for war. To save money, soldiers were actually quartered in English homes during wartime, and this was a very unpopular move. If any of you recall from American history classes that you may have had, this was an issue that the American colonists had with the British right before the Revolutionary War. The British were forcing the American colonists to house the British soldiers to save money. And the people were not happy. They felt that this went against their rights to their own homes. Some English nobles were actually arrested for refusing to lend money to the government in forced loans that Charles I was trying to enact. Since he could not get the consent of Parliament to raise taxes, he decided to try to basically force loans out of the wealthy in England. This is almost like going and doing a shakedown, the mob going and shaking down the nobles at the force of a gun, or in this case, probably more the force of a sword, to force them to pay. It's almost like being mugged by the king or by the king's men. By 1628, both houses of parliament, both the House of Lords, which is traditionally more conservative and more in line with the way that the kings think, and the House of Commons, which was usually more radical minded because they were the ones that were elected. Both of the houses of parliament were firmly opposed to the king. Now remember, this is a big deal. The parliament has always felt for 400 years now that they actually have a real say in the governing of England. This is a big impasse that has been reached. In 1628, the Petition of Right was an attempt by Parliament to encourage Charles to grant basic legal rights to the people of England in return for granting him the tax increases that he wanted. The provisions were this. Only Parliament had the right to actually levy taxes. They wanted to reiterate that power that only Parliament had. They also said no one should be imprisoned without due process of law, and all had the right to habeas corpus, meaning you had the right to face your accuser in court. No one should be forced to quarter soldiers in their homes either. If you were a private citizen, you could not be forced by the government to house a soldier in your home. These were all provisions, and if those sound familiar to you, they should, because those are a lot of the things that the colonists in America argued against the British when we started fighting the Revolutionary War. The last thing was martial law. The Parliament wanted to state that martial law could not be declared in peacetime. Martial law just means where the army is in charge of governing in an emergency situation. The king was trying to declare martial law to force the folks to pay him the money that he wanted when he was sending out his men to basically mug the nobles and take money from them, declaring martial law. And so that was something they said, if we are in peacetime, we cannot declare martial law. These were all demands that Parliament made in the Petition of Right. And they said if Charles agreed to sign the Petition of Right, they would grant him the tax increases that he wanted. But he couldn't do these other things. They thought that they might have him over a barrel and he might be a reasonable monarch and agree. Charles instead refused to sign the Petition of Right and dissolved Parliament in 1629. Parliament continued to refuse increased taxation without its consent, however. The Parliament also had demanded that any movement of the government toward Catholicism or Arminianism be treated as treason. You see, Charles I, yes, technically he was Protestant, just like his father was, but he had Catholic leanings, and a lot of the ministers that he had appointed to his cabinet were Catholic. He seemed to be favoring Catholics. He had a Catholic wife, and people were worried that he may attempt to allow for Catholicism to make a comeback in England, and they wanted to avoid that at all costs. Charles's rule without Parliament, once he suspended them from 1629, lasted until 1640. And this is called the Thorough. Charles ruled as an absolute monarch during that time, during that 11-year period. He raised money using medieval forms of forced taxation. Again, those with wealth had to pay. They would be shaken down at the point of a sword. They had no choice. And since the parliament has been suspended and no new elections were allowed to be held because he had declared martial law virtually, there's nothing the people could do about it. Needless to say, he is not making any friends with people doing this. And people are going to start to grumble and start to talk about rebelling against the king. He also initiated what he called ship money. Ship money was where all counties were now required to pay to outfit ships, where before only coastal communities had to pay ship money because those coastal communities made money off of the ships coming into their ports and doing business. So they were the ones that usually paid the taxes to help keep the ships in, in good form, in good order. But now he's forcing all counties to pay ship money. And much of that money was not going to keep the ships in good shape. They were actually going into the king's coffers. He also initiated some religious persecution of Puritans, and this was the biggest reason for the English Civil War. The Puritans had gained a lot of influence in the House of Commons by this point. Even though they were more radical minded than the regular Anglican Church of England folks. They were trying to use their position in the House of Commons to push through more religious reforms in the Church of England. And this persecution that they were now suffering under the king during this thorough period becomes the biggest reason, the straw that breaks the camel's back for the English Civil War's beginning. In 1640, there was the Short Parliament. The Scottish military revolt in response to Charles's attempt to impose the English Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Presbyterian Church was the reason why Charles had to allow Parliament to sit once again. In 1640, this rebellion in Scotland, his homeland, if you will, ultimately made it so he had to call Parliament back to get emergency funds to help put down this rebellion. Charles needed these new taxes to fight this war against Scotland. The Parliament, however, reconvened in 1640, but they refused to grant Charles new taxes if he did not accept the Petition of Rights and church reforms. Once again, they felt that they had him over a barrel and he would have to deal with them. Charles, however, disbanded Parliament again after it only sat for 1 month. So he's going to have to come up with a different way to put down for the funds to put down the Scottish Rebellion. And now he has ticked off the people in England in the House of Commons even more. Both sides are firmly digging in their heels, and this is what's going to lead to disaster. The Long Parliament will sit from 1640 to 1648. Desperate for money after the Scottish invasion of northern England in 1640, Charles finally agreed to certain demands by Parliament. Parliament's demands were this: Parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent. And Parliament must meet at least once every 3 years. And ship money was abolished. Those who persecuted Puritans were to be tried and executed, including Archbishop Laud, who you read about in your textbook, who had been an active participant. The Star Chamber, that had been around since Henry VII, the first Tudor king, would be abolished finally. Common law courts were supreme to the king's courts, and they refused funds to raise an army to defeat a revolt that was now happening in Ireland. The Puritans became the majority in the new elections for the House of Commons and Parliament against the king's Anglican supporters. A session of the Long Parliament with Charles I in the center is what you see depicted in this painting. This is what leads to the English Civil War. After 2 years of the demands being made with the Parliament, Charles could no longer uphold his end of the agreement. He just could not tolerate it any longer. So, the immediate cause that begins this English Civil War in 1642. Charles tried to arrest several Puritan MPs, that means member of Parliament, okay? Several Puritan MPs, but a crowd of 4,000 came to his defense. This was supposed to be a secret. This is known as the Gunpowder Plot. But ultimately, Charles is overcome. The plot gets out there, and 4,000 people come to the Puritan Parliament members' defense. An Irish rebellion had broken out, and Parliament was not willing to give the king an army either. In March of 1642, Charles declared war against his opponents in Parliament. The king has now declared war on Parliament, and thus begins the Civil War. The English Civil War will last from 1642 to 1649. Civil War erupts, And the groups are the Cavaliers, that's one side. They are the ones that support the king. The clergy and supporters of the Anglican Church were part of this group, as were the majority of the old nobility, the old gentry, both in the northern parts and in the western part of England. These were the traditional nobles, ones that held positions in the House of Lords, but not the House of Commons. Eventually, Irish Catholics who feared Puritanism more than Anglicanism also supported the king. They were also part of the Cavalier group. The Roundheads were the other side. They were the traditional Puritan Calvinists that opposed the king. They also consisted largely of any Puritans and Congregationalists, as well as the Presbyterian Calvinists who favored the Scottish church organization. They also allied with the Scots who had been revolting against Charles I in return for guarantees that Presbyterianism would be imposed on England after the war. They were also supported by the Presbyterian dominated folks living in London. So most of those living in London, in the capital city, supported the Parliament, not the king. They also were supported by the majority of the businessmen for obvious reasons. The businessmen were the ones who paid a lot of tax. They were the ones that were electing the members of the Houses of Parliament, the members of the House of Commons, and they were electing members who were going to enact rules, laws that would benefit them and others like them. This also included some of the more, I guess you would say, nouveau riche or newly rich gentry nobles in the South and in the East, ones that had made their money through trade rather than inheriting their noble titles, like the old traditional nobles that were of the Cavalier group. The Roundheads also had the support of the Navy and the Merchant Marine. So the king may have been able to demand that the army fight for him, but the Roundheads had the Navy and the Merchant Marine at their disposal. They also had the majority of all these other people, and they could raise their own land army if need be, which is exactly what they will do. Now, Oliver Cromwell was a recently elected MP or member of parliament who was a staunch Puritan and independent, if you will. And he had been elected in 1640 when the Long Parliament was enacted. He now will be the one responsible for raising the new model army and leading it to victory. The new model army will be known as the parliamentary forces that the Roundhead supporters will get behind. Charles I had surrendered to the Scots in 1646. Now remember, the Scots had been supporters of the parliamentary cause. They were supporters of the Roundhead cause. So when Charles surrendered to them, Parliament thought, hey, we've won. But no, Charles I, once he surrendered to the Scots, he turned them to his side. He convinced them that if they invaded England and restored him to the throne, he would make things good for them. He made a lot of promises to them that they would receive better treatment by the English that were resettling in Scotland and that they would be given some of their demands. So this caused a division among the parliamentary forces, among the Roundheads, between those Puritans as well as those Presbyterians. The Presbyterians and the non-Puritans had this division developed late in the war, and this looked as if the parliamentary forces would never be able to win. Cromwell refused Parliament's call to disband the army. Parliament had gotten cold feet. Once the Scots turned on the Roundheads, they switched sides and joined with Charles. Parliament decided that they might have to negotiate with Charles for a compromise. But Cromwell and the hardliners in Parliament and the supporters of the New Model Army refused to disband the army and said, no, we can beat Charles. So, as I said, Parliament had ordered the army to disband. Cromwell refused. Then Cromwell and the New Model Army successfully thwarted a Scottish invasion. Charles I had promised Scotland a Presbyterian system if they would help defeat Cromwell and put him back on the throne. Thwarted that. This will lead to Pride's Purge in 1648. As I said, Parliament had debated restoring Charles I to the throne. The New Model Army, without Cromwell's knowledge, removed all non-Puritans from the Parliament as a response to that, leaving only what is known as a rump parliament in order to only have supporters of the New Model Army's cause there. Now, they did this without Cromwell's knowledge, but of course they did this thinking that Cromwell would completely support them doing this. The rump, ultimately, are the ones responsible for putting Charles I on trial for treason. So instead of him being put back on the throne, instead he's arrested, he's thrown into the Tower of London, and eventually put on trial for treason against the people of England. Oliver Cromwell will dissolve the Long Parliament in 1648, and with his New Model Army forces forcing the issue, he will ultimately become the new leader of England. Charles I will be found guilty of treason, and in 1649, he will be beheaded. This effectively ended the English Civil War. He will be the first European king to be executed by his own subjects. This was a serious matter, folks, and it sent shockwaves throughout all of Europe. If the British people, the small group in Parliament, can actually behead their king, what does this mean for all those other absolute monarchs throughout the rest of Europe? Remember, most of Europe was under an absolute monarchy system, individual absolute monarchs throughout Europe. Whereas in England now, a monarch who tried to rule as an absolute monarch is executed by the people. This shows a contemporary woodcut of the beheading of Charles I in 1649. This is a serious matter. This is regicide. New factions emerged after the Civil War is over, demanding reforms from this new government that's being established in England under Cromwell. The Levelers were one group. They were radical religious revolutionaries who sought social and political reforms. They wanted a more egalitarian society, a more equal society for all groups. The Diggers denied Parliament's authority at all and rejected private land ownership. They were more socialistic. The Quakers believed in an inner light, that there was a divine spark in each person. They were an offshoot of the Anabaptists that we talked about in the previous unit. They had rejected church authority, rejecting the authority of the Anglican Church. And they had very pacifist views, did not believe in serving in the military or in paying taxes. They wanted to also allow women in the clergy, and they wanted to push these kinds of religious reforms. So, a bunch of different people. The period under Cromwell, where Cromwell is ruling in England, he's not a monarch. He's what they call a Lord Protector. It's sometimes called the interregnum. The interregnum lasts between 1649 and 1650 with a rule with no king. And then they established what's called the Commonwealth, which is a virtual republic that abolished the monarchy officially and the House of Lords, leaving only the House of Commons with the Lord Protector Cromwell to run the show. In reality, England became a military state with an army of about 44,000 men, which really became the best in Europe. The Scottish Presbyterians proclaimed that Charles II, the son of the executed Charles I, should be the new king. And Cromwell, once again, will come to fight against those Presbyterians, and he defeats a Scottish invasion that had supported the Presbyterian cause. Charles II, who really isn't really Charles II yet, since he's not really crowned king, the son of Charles I, will flee England to keep from losing his head, and he will be living in exile for several years. Don't worry, he'll be back. Under Cromwell, who became Lord Protector, they finally start referring to the new government in England as the Protectorate. Again, like I said, sometimes it's referred to as other things like the Commonwealth, but it really is the Protectorate. Cromwell was Lord Protector. In effect, he was leading a Puritan dictatorship in England, a military dictatorship where he commanded the military and he commanded the parliament. He dissolved the Rump Parliament in 1653 after a series of disputes. Even though he was a Puritan and they were as well, they had disagreements, and he wanted to rule more directly as a dictator, so he dissolved them. England ultimately was divided into 12 districts under Cromwell, and each under the control of a military general that answered to Cromwell. He denied any religious freedom to Anglicans or to Catholics and insisted that only the Puritan way be held. He allowed, however, Jews to return to England in 1655. So he did not believe in religious toleration for the Anglicans and the Catholics, but he did allow the Jews who had been run out of England in an earlier time to return to England in 1655. Cromwell's military campaigns. Ireland was still a problem, and so he had to put down a rebellion there and invaded Ireland in 1649. This will eventually lead to what's known as the Act of Settlement. The land from two-thirds of the Catholic property owners in Ireland was given to the Protestant English colonists. The Irish lost the war, if you will. Cromwell's forces will win, and the Act of Settlement will allow two-thirds of the land in Ireland to be taken over by British. This is when Ireland ultimately becomes a colony of England. The the southern one-third of Ireland will remain predominantly Catholic. And ultimately, this will cause a lot of friction for years and years and years to come between the British and the Irish. Irish continue to push for home rule. The British will not want to give that. It will eventually happen, but not until after World War I. Cromwell also conquered Scotland in 1651 to 1652. So most of Ireland comes under the British flag, as well as Scotland during Cromwell's reign. This is when we start seeing the beginning of what will be a United Kingdom of England instead of just England. The Puritan-controlled government sought to regulate the moral life of England by commanding that people follow strict moral codes that were enforced by the army. This is why oftentimes Cromwell is referred to as No Fun Cromwell. All of the culture in England was stagnated because of Cromwell's reign, Cromwell's puritanical reign. The press was heavily censored. Sports were prohibited. Theaters were closed. No opera, no symphony, no plays. Now remember, folks, just a generation or two before this was the heyday of the Elizabethan theater with William Shakespeare, being all the rage. So England was kind of the place for theater for a long time, and that was ending with Cromwell's reign. This seriously alienated many English people from Cromwell's military rule. No from Cromwell was not what they expected when they executed the king. Cromwell will die in 1658. And since he is a Lord Protector and not a king, there was kind of this hiccup. What are we supposed to do now? His son, Richard, tried to assume the power of Lord Protector, but he was very ineffective. And ultimately, um, there had to be a decision being made. The Stuart monarchy could come back under Charles II, who had been living in exile, mostly in France. And so those left in the parliament from the old days came together and they decided, this experiment without a king in England didn't really work for us so much. We do like having a king, but we do want their power to be limited by the parliament, and we want the parliament's powers to be more strictly adhered to by that king. So they invited Charles II to be restored to the throne, restoring the Stuart dynasty and restoring the British monarchy in 1660. Key concept. Key concept. Now, 1660, we call this the Restoration period. The Cavalier Parliament, especially in the House of Lords that returned back after the death of Cromwell, will restore Charles II to the throne in 1660, and he will reign until 1685. While in exile, he agreed to abide by Parliament's decisions if he were to be put back on the throne. Parliament was stronger in relation to the king than ever before in England as a result. He agreed to Parliament's demands. He was just happy to be king, folks. He thought after seeing his father be executed that he would never be king of England, that he'd be living in exile the rest of his life. So he was delighted to become king, and he was willing to agree to Parliament's demands for more power, and this will increase the power of Parliament ultimately. The king's power would never be absolute in England. This solidified that. He granted religious toleration. He allowed for religious toleration, which was one of the demands that Parliament had made. And he became known as the Merry Monarch for his affable personality, meaning that he was very easy to get along with. He was a jovial guy. But he's also known as the Merry Monarch because he restored culture back to England. The theaters were opened again, the operas were being held, the symphony was playing, all of that culture returned. And so he was known as the Merry Monarch for that reason as well. By the way, he's also known as the Merry Monarch because he had lots of illegitimate children. He and his wife never were able to have an heir themselves. It was probably because she was barren. But he had lots of illegitimate children, but they cannot inherit the throne. So this created a problem for him. By the way, just so you know, there's another little factoid that you might want to know. The prefix before a last name, Fitz, like Fitzroy, Fitzpatrick, Fitzcharles, if you will, Fitzhenry, that means, the Fitz means a bastard son of a king. So oftentimes there would be, Fitzroy's, which means Fitzroyal, means bastard son of a king just by itself, or Fitzpatrick, or Fitzhenry, or in this case, Fitzcharles. That's where that prefix comes from. So he had lots of Fitzcharleses around, but no legitimate heir, which is why after his death, it will pass to his brother. So, we also see during the reign of Charles II the development of political parties. First of all, we have the Whigs. The Whigs initially, they were anti-Catholic and opposed to James II, who will come to the throne after Charles II. James II had converted to become Catholic during the time when he was living in exile. Remember, both Charles II and James II were the sons of Charles I, who had been beheaded. James II, during his time in exile, had married his second wife. His first wife had died. He had been Protestant with his first wife. He had two grown children, daughters from that previous wife who had been raised Protestant. But now he had married a Catholic princess. He converted to Catholicism himself. And this was going to be a problem because if he inherited the throne and he was Catholic and he had any male heirs that he was going to raise Catholic with his new Catholic wife, this could be a problem for those in England who wanted to keep England Protestant. Later, the Whigs, that were anti-Catholic and opposed to James II, they were composed of wealthy middle class and Puritans who favored Parliament and religious toleration. So they would be the ones that would be more liberal minded, if you will. They were more liberal in the classical sense. Then you have the Tories as a political party. Initially, they supported James II as the king. So Tory sounds like royal, kind of. So you can think of them. Tory supported the royalty. Um, they were composed of nobles, the gentry, which were maybe they were like wealthy landowners. They might not have been the traditional nobles, but they were like nouveau riche. And Anglicans who supported the monarchy over Parliament. Essentially, they were conservatives. Now, back to the reign of Charles II. There were a couple of acts that were posted. First one was the Clarendon Code of 1661, which was instituted by a group that were very much supporters of monarchy. They were Anglicans, and they kind of wanted to undo some of the puritanical things that had been put in place under the reign of Cromwell when the Puritans were kind of running the show. They sought to drive all Puritans out of both political and religious life. Now, this would not actually be possible, but they did limit the influence that some of those Puritans had had during the time of Cromwell. Then, probably even more important is the Test Act of 1673. The Test Act excluded those unwilling to receive the sacrament of the Church of England from voting, holding office, preaching, teaching, attending universities, or assembling for meetings. This was a way that the Anglicans were trying to force the issue, saying, no, England will remain Protestant, yes, but it will remain Anglican, not Puritan. And this was also a way for some of those in Parliament to say that England will never again become Catholic. Now, this would be an issue, remember, if the younger brother, James, becomes James II of England since he is Catholic. So this was a way for them to try to avoid allowing him to become king if Charles II died without a legitimate heir, which by 1673 looked like it was going to happen. The Habeas Corpus Act was another act that was declared by Parliament in 1679. The Whig Parliament, remember that means the more classically liberal group, sought to limit Charles's power with the Habeas Corpus Act. The provisions. First of all, it enabled judges to demand that prisoners be in court during their trials. Again, habeas corpus, the right to face your accusers. It also required just cause for continued imprisonment. And it provided for speedy trials. You couldn't be forced to just languish in prison for years and years and years without a trial date being set. It forbade also double jeopardy. If you were tried for a particular crime and no resolution came out of, no verdict came out of the trial, it was a hung jury, so to speak, then you could not be tried for the same thing again. These should all sound very familiar to you. These are the same kinds of guarantees that are in our legal system here in America. Now, Charles II dies without a legitimate heir, like I said before. And instead, now the power passes to his younger brother, James, who becomes James II. Remember, he has converted to Catholicism in his exile. His first Protestant wife dying, his grown Protestant daughters not, being under his roof any longer. And he now has a new young Catholic wife and a new baby boy who he's raising Catholic. Would this mean that that heir, that Catholic heir, would ultimately force Catholicism back in England? This was the problem. And this is why we will eventually have the Glorious Revolution in 1688. James II inherits the throne. He sought to return England to Catholicism, much like Mary Tudor had done, Queen Mary I, who had been the daughter, remember, of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. He appointed many Catholics to high positions in government and in colleges to try to force the issue. But ultimately, Parliament, that had gained a lot of power under the Restoration period, under Charles II, refused to allow this. After only 3 years of him being in power, we have what's called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It's the final act in the struggle for political sovereignty in England. Parliament was not willing to sacrifice any constitutional gains they had made from the English Civil War to return to absolute monarchy, or close to it. Two issues in particular drove Parliament to action in 1688. James's reissue of the Declaration of Indulgence, granting freedom of worship to Catholics in England, and his demand that the declaration be read in the Anglican Church on 2 successive Sundays was one of those issues. The second was the birth of that Catholic heir to the English throne in 1688, that baby boy that I mentioned before. This was really the straw that broke the camel's back. Parliament not wanting to lose their power, the people of England not wanting to return to Catholicism. Ultimately, James II recognizes that he has no real support. Even the Tories that were traditionally supporters of the monarchy, they were Anglican. They were not willing to allow England to return to Catholicism. So they also will join in the cause against James II. It's called the Glorious Revolution ultimately because no blood will be shed. James II, remember, was the youngest son of Charles I. He had seen his father be executed by the British. He did not want to go down that road. He was not going to fight a civil war with the Parliament like his father had done and lose, and then ultimately lose his own head. Instead, he agreed to abdicate his throne. That means give up the throne. His two daughters from his previous marriage that had been raised Protestants were Mary and Anne. Parliament, deciding that they didn't want to have a not have a king, or have a monarch, I should say, again, they're not going to go back to the way things were with Cromwell, decided that they could keep the Stuart line going ultimately by allowing Mary and Anne to be the heirs rather than James II's son. Since they forced James II off of the throne now, they turned to Mary and Anne. Technically, they're still Stuarts. They were daughters of James II. First was Mary. She was the eldest daughter. Mary had married a Dutch stadtholder whose name was William of Orange. And ultimately, William of Orange and Mary will come to England and they will be invited by Parliament to assume the throne and rule jointly. In late 1688, when James officially abdicates his throne and flees to France, he had actually offered for concessions to Parliament, but they were refused. William and Mary will come to Parliament and they will assume the throne. And they will rule jointly. The Stuart line is traced through Mary, but she is married to William. And of course, this gains a big, I guess you would say, ally with the Dutch for the British throne. William III and Mary II were declared joint sovereigns by Parliament, meaning that William and Mary have equal power. It's not that King William has more power than Queen Mary, because remember, Queen Mary is the one that has the bloodline, but William III has the wealth and the support of the Dutch behind him. They will declare joint sovereigns by 1888. This is the crest of King William King William III and Queen Mary II of England, who accepted officially a constitutional monarchy in England. This is key. They invited William and Mary to England, but they said to them, "You may reign as monarchs as long as you agree to reign as limited monarchs. You will abide by a constitution that we will write, and you will have certain powers outlined in that constitution, and Parliament will have certain powers outlined in that constitution." In other words, the power of the monarchs will be limited by the power of the Parliament. And of course, key to that is the power of the House of Commons, which was elected by the people. Now, remember, folks, it's not elected by all the people. It's still only elected by the wealthiest people in England. But this is a step in the right direction, limiting the power of the king, balancing it with the power of the people. This is something that we will see be fostered more and more from this point forward. This is the first constitutional monarchy in history. And eventually, this is going to lead to more people throughout Europe to push for similar kinds of reforms in their governments. This is quite different than an absolute monarchy. Remember, most of Europe is being ruled by absolute monarchs, whereas now England has a constitutional monarchy. This is a big deal. The English Bill of Rights will be written and signed by William and Mary in 1689. This basically is the beginning of what we call an English Constitution. William and Mary accepted what became known as this English Bill of Rights. England had become a constitutional monarchy. The Bill of Rights established parliamentary sovereignty. There were certain powers that Parliament was guaranteed that the king or queen could never take away, and they could never challenge. This became the hallmark for constitutionalism in Europe, although it will not really happen in most of Europe for another century. The Petition of Right from 1628, the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, and the English Bill of Rights in 1689 are all part of what we now call the English Constitution. Provisions. The monarch could not be a Roman Catholic, period. Laws could be made only with the consent of Parliament. So now it's not just that the king couldn't raise taxes, or queen couldn't raise taxes without the consent of Parliament. The king or queen cannot create any law without the consent of Parliament. Ultimately, folks, this is what creates the constitutional monarchy that the English still have today, although Parliament has even more power now than they did back then in 1688. Another provision, Parliament had the right of free speech. A standing army in peacetime was not legal unless Parliament approved it. And taxation was illegal without parliamentary approval. By the way, folks, this provision right there is the one that the American colonists use as why they think that it is legitimate that they revolt against the British in 1776. No taxation without representation in Parliament. We'll talk more about that later. But that's the one that the British citizens living in the Americas, in the American colonies, will say is being violated. That's the right that they say the king is violating. Um, Anyhow, we'll talk more about that later. Excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishments were also prohibited. And the right to a trial by jury, due process of law, and reasonable bail were guaranteed. People had the right to bear arms as well, but only Protestants, not Catholics. Catholics did not have any political rights in England. They were able to worship, but they didn't have any political rights. It provided for free elections to Parliament and could be dissolved only by its own consent. Parliament could only be dissolved by its own consent. Now, again, when I say free elections, remember, you still had to be a landowner and a big landowner to be able to vote for the House of Commons and Parliament. But again, it's a step in the right direction. The people also had the right of petition in the English Bill of Rights. All of these should sound kind of familiar because a lot of our own legal system is based on these same principles. The Glorious Revolution, however, was not a democratic revolution, and this is why. Power remained largely in the hands of the nobility and the gentry until at least the mid-19th century in England. Again, those that had the right to vote were only the wealthy, not the regular middle class, and certainly not the lower classes. The property requirements for voting made sure of that. Parliament essentially represented those upper classes as a result. The majority of English people did not have a say in political affairs. That will come later, and we'll talk about that in this class in a later unit. The most notable defense of what had happened in the Glorious Revolution came from a political philosopher named John Locke in his second treatise of civil government that was published in 1690, just 2 short years after the Glorious Revolution and 1 year after the publication of the English Bill of Rights. Ultimately, the second treatise of civil government is basically legitimizing what the Parliament had done. In this treatise, he stated that the people create a government to protect their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And if the government goes beyond their mandate to protect those rights, the people have the right to rebel. Ultimately, it is John Locke's principles that will launch a new movement called the Enlightenment. And of course, our revolution in this country, the American Revolution, is an Enlightenment-based revolution based on the principles of Locke. The Toleration Act of 1689 was another act that was initiated by the new constitutional government in England. It granted right to worship for Protestant nonconformists like the Puritans and the Quakers, although they were not allowed to hold public office. So freedom of worship maybe, but not equality in the eyes of the law, not the same political rights. It did not extend religious liberties to Catholics. They were still allowed to worship in their own homes, but not publicly. Did not allow religious liberties to Jews or Unitarians either, although they were, like I say, left alone to worship how they wanted in their own homes. The Act of Settlement in 1701 provided guidelines for succession once the Protestant Stuarts had passed on. Mary, as queen, was never able to have an heir to the throne. William and Mary did not have an heir to the throne, and it would pass to her sister Anne after her. Anne never married and did not have an heir. So this is the way it went. In 1701, when they didn't know all that was happening, they said if King William or his sister-in-law Anne died without children, King William and Queen Mary, that should say, or the sister-in-law Anne, who inherited next, died without children, the crown then would pass to the granddaughter of James the First, old James the First from way, way back, okay, in the early 1600s, the first Stuart king. The granddaughter of James the First was actually a Hanoverian Electress Dowager. That means that she was from Hanover, which was a German principality. Okay, it would either pass to her or if she was dead, her Protestant heirs. This act of settlement was done to make sure that a Protestant remained on the throne in England. But this would also mean that the next dynasty, the Hanoverian dynasty in England, would be really not English people. They still had English blood in them technically from way back. James the First, who was really Scottish, but also related to the Tudors, but they would be predominantly German. The Stuarts were no longer in the line of succession as a result of this. When Anne died in 1714, her Hanoverian heir assumed the throne as King George the First. It will be one of his successors that the American colonists will rebel against. The Act of Union happens in 1707. It united officially England and Scotland into what will now be called Great Britain. Why would Scotland agree to give up its independence? The Scots desperately desired access to England's trade empire and believed that it would continue to fall behind if it did not enter into a union. There were some in Scotland who continued to fight this, but most agreed financially, economically, they needed to be a part of Great Britain. The Scottish Presbyterians feared the Stuarts, who were now staunchly Catholic, might attempt to return to the throne in Scotland. Remember, James II had been forced off the throne, but he had a son that he was raising Catholic, and what would happen if that son tried to say that throne should be mine in England? And so, anyways, this was a problem. So, within a few decades, Scotland transformed into a modern society with a dynamic economic and intellectual growth because of their union with Great Britain. The Union flag was first created by James I, actually, back in 1606, when he, as the king of both Scotland and England, sought to unify them. In 1610, Parliament refused the Union, and the creation of Great Britain would thus not occur for another 100 years. They eventually will adopt this flag. It looks similar to the British Union Jack that we have now, although the smaller red line that goes through the X behind the bigger cross of red is not there. That will be added later when Wales is added to the British Union. So this is what we call the Stuart Burger in AP Euro. It's actually a little thing to help you remember who comes when in the Stuart monarchy. Of course, we have Cromwell in the middle. So anyways, James the First is the top bun. And then Charles the First is the tomato, I guess you would say. Some people don't like tomato, so eventually he gets ditched. Like some people take the tomato off their burger. And then we have Cromwell, the no-nonsense beef patty in the middle. Then you have Charles II come, who is like the lettuce. And, some people like the lettuce and some people try to push the lettuce around. It's kind of wimpy. It can't really challenged Parliament too much because, of course, it is being given the power by Parliament, and he's just happy to be there. And then, of course, you get to James the Second, who is the bottom bun. The bottom bun, that always absorbs all the grease from the rest of the burger that nobody likes. So eventually you have the plate, which is after that the Glorious Revolution, which brings a constitutional monarchy to place in England under William and Mary. Anyways, the Stuart burger is a fun little way to try to remember. It's James the First, Charles the First, Cromwell, Charles the Second, James the Second, Glorious Revolution. Okay, JCCCJ, Glorious Revolution. The anatomy of revolution. It starts off with the old regime, the conservatives, the royalists in charge, leads to the revolution run by moderates, parliament made up of the Puritans and the Presbyterians, then turns more radical as the radicals take the revolution to the extreme during the English Civil War, the independents under Cromwell and the New Model Army, as well as those other factions, the levelers and diggers, are even more extreme. And this eventually leads to a Thermidor like reaction, which I'll discuss more later what that means, but it means kind of like a return to normalcy, moving away from the extremism where Cromwell's protectorate is put in place. And then eventually a restoration, a return of the conservatives to power under Charles II. However, his power would be limited far more than his father's had been. English cabinet system in the 18th century would then be created. The structure of it, leading ministers of the House of Commons will govern the country ultimately. The prime minister would be the leader of the majority, meaning whichever party or faction during elections was elected to the majority of the seats in parliament. The leader of that majority party would become the prime minister and would be the leader of ultimately the parliament or the government. Sir Robert Walpole is seen as the first prime minister in British history. He led the cabinet from 1721 to 1742 and established the precedent that the cabinet was responsible to the House of Commons. Ultimately, the leader of the parliament would be the leader of the party that controlled the most seats in the House of Commons elections. Now, early Hanoverian kings, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. George I, as we said before, he reigned from 1714 to 1727. He regularly presided over cabinet meetings, worked very well with cabinet. George II, his heir, reigned from 1727 to 1760. He discontinued the practice of meeting with the cabinet, so he didn't get along with them as well. Did not seem as much a supporter of these ideas. Neither king, however, spoke English fluently, and they seemed more concerned with their territory in Hanover than in England. And this causes some, I guess you would say, disjointedness in the British government as a result. Decision making by the crown declined as a result, and ultimately the parliament became more and more powerful. Key concept. The following slides will be on the Dutch Republic and Dutch art. If you notice, the blanks are filled in on the rest of this on the Word document. You're welcome. Key concept. The Dutch Republic is another example of constitutionalism in Western Europe. The Dutch Republic is also known as the Netherlands, and it is the part of the Netherlands or the Dutch region that had wrenched itself free from Spanish control under Philip II. The first half of the 17th century, the Dutch Republic is seen to have been experiencing a golden age in the Netherlands. A lot of economic prosperity and as a lot of influence ultimately as a result. It developed an oligarchy style government of urban gentry and rural landholders to promote trade and to Protect traditional rights. The government was dominated by the bourgeoisie, whose wealth and power limited the power of the state. So, this is truly a Republican type of government. Now, still only the wealthy have the real power, but as we see, it is not a traditional monarchy, it is a constitutional republic. Rembrandt is from the Netherlands and he was painting during this time period. This painting here is called The Masters of the Cloth Guild, 1662. It's a famous collective portrait. It's showing the middle class leaders of a guild conducting business. The image is emblematic of the industriousness of the Calvinist burghers in the Netherlands, the ones that ultimately controlled the republic in the Netherlands. The government was run by representative institutions as a result. The government consisted of an organized confederation of 7 provinces, each with representative government. Each province sent a representative to what was called an Estates General. Holland and Zeeland were the most influential provinces in the Dutch Republic. Each province was autonomous as well, meaning self-governing. So they would cooperate with a national government, if you will, but they still had their own local governments. Each province elected what was called a stadtholder, a governor, and a military leader. By the way, William of Orange was a stadtholder. He was the stadtholder of Orange, a province in the Dutch Republic. So, needless to say, he went from being a governor in the Netherlands to being the King of England. Heck yeah, he'll agree to whatever demands Parliament wants. He'll rule as a constitutional monarch. Are you kidding me? During times of crisis, all 7 provinces would elect the same stadtholder, usually from the House of Orange, William's House of Orange. Key concept: religious toleration. Calvinism was the dominant religion in the Dutch Republic, but it was split between the Dutch Reformed Church and Arminians. Arminianism was Calvinism, but they did not adhere to the idea of predestination. Arminians enjoyed full rights after 1632. Toleration of Catholics and Jews was also enacted, but with fewer rights than traditional Calvinists. Toleration enabled a cosmopolitan society, however, that promoted trade. Places where Catholics and Jews might be shunned, they felt welcomed in the Dutch Republic. And ultimately, that promotes the Dutch Republic to become a very wealthy, merchant-based society. Key concept: the Netherlands became the greatest mercantile nation of the 17th century as a result of this. Innovations in banking and finance promoted the growth of urban financial centers and a money-based economy. Amsterdam became the banking and commercial center of Europe in the 17th century. It replaced Antwerp, that had dominated in the late 16th century. We talked about that in Unit 1. Amsterdam becomes the richest city in Europe with a population of over 100,000 people. The Bank of Amsterdam, 1609, was built in 1609. It was the first central bank in European history, first national bank. It offered far lower interest rates than English banks. This was the major reason why other nations ultimately started banking with the Bank of Amsterdam. And this is the major reason why it became dominant, the dominant bank in all of Europe. The Dutch Republic had to rely on commerce since it had few natural resources at its disposal. It was not a big farming center. The Dutch had the largest fleet in the world that was dedicated to trade, not a navy, but a maritime fleet. They had several outstanding ports that became a hub of European trade because of their location. But it lacked government controls and monopolies that interfered with free enterprise. And so this is why it became kind of the business capital in Europe in the 17th century. Fishing was the cornerstone of the Dutch economy. The major industries in the Dutch Republic included textiles, that means cloth, furniture, fine woolen goods, sugar refining, the sugar that comes from the New World, tobacco cutting, again, tobacco coming from the New World, brewing, pottery, glass, printing, paper making, weapons manufacturing, and shipbuilding. The Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company were organized as cooperative ventures of private enterprise and the state. They were what we call joint stock companies. They had a combination of private investment as well as state investment. The Dutch East India Company challenged the Portuguese in Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and Sri Lanka I have on there twice. Sorry, guys. They will be able to eventually dominate the spice trade, taking it away from the Portuguese, who had dominated it since the end of the 1400s. The Dutch West India Company traded extensively with Latin American and African territories. By 1700, the Dutch dominated the spice trade in Indonesia and other parts of Asia with these joint stock companies, a combination of public and private ownership. This is Jan Vermeer's view of Delft, 1660 to 61. It's a landscape that shows Vermeer's bustling hometown, with ships presumably engaged in trade in the foreground and various church buildings in the town hinting religious diversity. Key concept: the foreign policy of the Dutch. Dutch participation against the Habsburgs in the Thirty Years' War led to its recognition by all of Europe as an independent country free from Spanish control in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia. That was discussed as part of that treaty agreement at the end of Unit 2. When the 30 Years' War came to an end, finally the Dutch Republic was recognized as an independent nation by the rest of Europe. England's navigation laws and removal of the Dutch from New York reduced Dutch economic influence in North America, however. The English and the Dutch fought over who would control territories in North America. Initially, New York was occupied by the Dutch. They were the ones that came and settled there first, and they actually named it New Amsterdam. Once the British were able to outmaneuver the Dutch and take New Amsterdam from them, they rename it New York. War with England and France, the Dutch fighting against both England and France in the 1670s, damaged the Dutch Republic. A lot of this happens when wars were going on, especially with France, under what we call the Wars of Louis XIV. By the end of the War of Spanish Succession, that last big war of Louis XIV that ended in 1713, the Dutch Republic saw a significant economic decline. That war, as well as other wars that they had been fighting with France and Britain, um, were so costly that the Dutch dwindled as an influence. And instead, Great Britain and France would then become the two dominant powers in the Atlantic trade. This is by the beginning of the 18th century. So the Dutch were dominant for, almost a century, but they would lose a lot of that dominance in the early 18th century, being replaced and eclipsed by Great Britain and France. So Spain has declined at the end of the 16th century, By the end of the 17th century, the Dutch will decline, leaving Great Britain and France firmly in the driver's seat as the two dominant powers in Europe and in the world. Now let's talk a little bit about Dutch style painting in the Dutch Republic, the 17th century. Key concept and key concept. The Dutch style painting in the Dutch Republic. The Dutch style was a human centered naturalism that considered individuals and everyday life appropriate objects of artistic representation. And it was encouraged through the patronage of both princes and commercial elites. Artistic movements also reflected the outlook and values of the commercial and bourgeois society that existed in the Dutch Republic. Characteristics. It did not share the Baroque style of trying to overwhelm the viewer. Now remember, Baroque is like really big, really wow factor, lots of gold, lots of in your face, lots of emotion, lots of movement, or the implication of movement, I should say. Sometimes bordering on gaudy. This is exactly the reverse of that. It reflected the Dutch Republic's wealth and religious toleration of secular subjects. It also reflected the urban and rural settings of Dutch life during the Golden Age of the Netherlands. Many works were commissioned by merchants or by government organizations. Rembrandt is probably the most important painter from this period. Perhaps the greatest of all Baroque artists, yet he really doesn't fit neatly into that category, or any other for that matter. Scenes covered an enormous range throughout his career. He used extremes of light and dark, like the Baroque style did. However, his works were far more intimate and psychological than typical Baroque works. Instead of showing you in your face kind of emotion, his figures looked more contemplative, almost as if you could see into their brain what they were thinking. He painted with the restraint also of a classicist style. So that's why he really doesn't fit into any style. He uses Baroque light and dark, but he uses the restraint of the classical style that had been, you know, uh, predominant during the Renaissance age. This is one of Rembrandt's most famous works, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp, 1632. They are having an anatomy lesson. This was, he was dissecting a body, which really was something that was frowned upon in Catholic countries. So this is showing that, the Dutch are not Catholic. They are Protestant minded. They believe it's important to learn about the body and how it works in order to cure diseases and those kinds of things. And this is going to foster the scientific revolution even more. We'll talk about the scientific revolution in the next unit, but just so you know, it is overlapping with the timeline here of what's going on. Here's Rembrandt's self-portrait from 1659. He did a lot of self-portraits. You can almost see him aging if you line up all of his self-portraits together. Jan Vermeer is another very famous Dutch artist, 1632 to 1675. His paintings specialized in simple domestic interior scenes of ordinary people. Like Rembrandt, he was a master in the use of light. Frans Hals, you'll see some of his work in just a moment. Frans Hals is another, 1580 to 1666. His portraits of middle class people and militia companies were what made him popular. Here is a Jan Vermeer, The Milkmaid, which was done in 1658. Again, interior scenes. You can see the light source coming from the window and streaming in over her face. You can see the cast of the shadows where the light hits, very realistic. You can see it's just a domestic scene. She's doing ordinary daily activity that a milkmaid would do, a servant, if you will, in a household of a wealthy person. Enamored with regular people and regular everyday life events. Franz Hals, Isabella Coimans, wife of Stephen Geralt, 1652. This shows you portraiture becomes very, very important and popular in Dutch painting. Again, the light source, the light and dark, you see the light seems to be coming from somewhere off of the painting, flooding the face of this individual. And of course, trying to show realistically what people look like. She seems to have almost an impish like grin on her face. What is she thinking? We don't know. Playful, if you will. Very popular. And that's it.